It all started the day Maya told me about the Forsaken Trail. I'd never heard of it before, but I guess that made sense since I wasn't from around here. I'd only been living with Aunt Laura for a few months after my dad vanished. Mom couldn't cope after the accident, so she sent me off to this tiny, eerie town in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. Aunt Laura was nice enough, but the house was old and smelled like dust and mothballs, and I always felt so alone. The town felt worse, quiet, with too many dark corners and fog that never seemed to lift. Maya, Caleb, and Jordan were the only kids who talked to me at school. They weren't bad, but they had known each other forever, and I felt like an outsider, like I was trying to get into a secret club. Still, they let me hang out with them most days after school. That's when Maya first mentioned the legend. "You haven't heard of the path?" Maya asked one afternoon as we sat on the rusted swings at the old playground. The air was chilly, and the wind kept blowing dead leaves around in little circles. I shrugged. "Nope. What is it?" Caleb leaned in, eyes wide. "It's an old trail that only shows up during a blood moon," he whispered, like it was some big secret. "If you walk it, you can make a wish. Any wish." He paused for dramatic effect. "But if you step off the path, the Forsaken will get you." I raised an eyebrow. "The Forsaken?" Jordan, who usually didn't say much, nodded. "Spirits of people who walked the path and broke the rules. They're stuck there forever, and if you mess up, they'll twist your wish into something awful." My stomach did a little flip. It sounded like one of those ghost stories meant to freak people out, but I could tell they believed it. Caleb's older brother was supposed to have tried it, and he swore it was real. I didn't want to seem scared, so I tried to act cool. "So when does this blood moon happen?" "Tonight," Maya said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "We're going to try it," she added. For a second, I thought about backing out. Something about the way they talked about the path was unsettling. But I didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. I'd already felt out of place since I moved here, and if I backed out now, they'd probably never let me forget it. "I'm in," I said, forcing a smile. My heart pounded harder in my chest, but I told myself it was just a story. Nothing was going to happen. "Meet us by the old signpost in the woods at midnight," Caleb said. That evening, as I walked home, the clouds were thick, but I could still see the edges of the blood moon rising in the sky. The air felt colder than usual, and the trees lining the road seemed to loom closer, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out toward me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my stomach a mess of nerves and excitement. The house creaked around me, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows creeping through the hall. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight. It was time. Midnight felt a lot scarier than I thought it would. I crept out of Aunt Laura's house as quietly as I could, closing the door behind me without making a sound. The night air was freezing, colder than it should have been for early fall, and the thick fog that always surrounded this town was heavier tonight, almost suffocating. The full blood moon hung low in the sky, glowing a deep red through the mist, casting everything in an eerie light. It didn't feel real. It felt like something out of a nightmare. I made my way down the road toward the old signpost in the woods where we were supposed to meet. My flashlight flickered as I walked, and for a second, I thought about turning back. But I wasn't about to back out now. I was already this far, and I wasn't going to be the only one too scared to go through with it. When I got there, Maya, Caleb, and Jordan were already waiting for me. Their flashlights cut long beams through the fog like knives. Caleb was grinning like he'd just won a prize. "Ready for the path of the Forsaken?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. I swallowed hard and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "All right," Maya said, stepping up to the old, weathered signpost. It looked ancient, with faded lettering and a wooden arrow pointing into the dark forest. "This is where it starts." Jordan, quiet as always, pulled out his phone and checked the time. "It's midnight," he said. "We have to do it now." Caleb explained the ritual again, even though we already knew it. "Turn off your flashlights, close your eyes, and think of your wish. If we're worthy, the path will appear." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the button on my flashlight. My mind raced. Did I really want to do this? But before I could change my mind, the others turned off their lights, plunging us into complete darkness. The fog was so thick that I could barely make out their shapes in the moonlight. "Close your eyes," Caleb whispered. I closed them, even though my heart pounded harder in my chest. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to do this. But what choice did I have? Couldn't back out now. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I thought about my dad. How he disappeared on that boat months ago. How no one ever found his body. The ache in my chest grew stronger as I made my wish. I wanted him back. I wanted to see him again, alive and well, like nothing had ever happened. The silence around me was deafening. No one said a word. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me. Then, without warning, the feeling changed. The ground beneath me shifted. I opened my eyes, my heart racing. The others were gone. Instead of the old signpost and familiar woods, there was a narrow, winding trail in front of me, illuminated by the blood moon's crimson light. The trees were closer now, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the path like long, bony fingers. I swallowed hard and clicked my flashlight, but it didn't work. I hit it against my hand a few times, but it stayed dead. I looked around, hoping to see Maya, Caleb, or Jordan, but there was no sign of them. It was just me alone. I took a shaky breath, the cold air burning my throat. There was only one way to go, so I started walking. Every step I took made the air feel heavier, colder. The trees on either side of the trail seemed to press in, their twisted branches reaching toward me like they wanted to pull me off the path. The silence was thick, too thick. I could hear my own breath, loud and shaky, echoing in the cold night air. Then came the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I stopped to listen, but when I did, the footsteps stopped too. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, and waited. Silence again. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, just the wind or something. But when I started walking again, there it was, soft but steady, like someone was walking just behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark trees, but no one was there. Only more twisted branches and shadows. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my hands sweating despite the cold. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just the stillness of the forest. I kept walking, but this time faster. The path seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the woods like it was leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. The footsteps were back, closer this time. They followed me no matter how quickly I moved. I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. My throat felt tight, and panic started to claw up my spine. After what felt like hours of walking, I saw something ahead, a flicker of light. I hurried toward it, hoping it was Caleb, Maya, or Jordan. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't them. It was a small cabin, barely standing, with a weak fire burning in a pit outside. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood rotting and covered in moss. But the fire was new, crackling in the stillness of the night. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every instinct telling me to turn around and run. But where would I go? The path behind me seemed darker than ever, and the footsteps had stopped. But I knew whatever had been following me was still out there. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. "You came to walk the path, didn't you?" I spun toward the fire and saw him, a boy about my age standing by the fire pit. He was pale, way too pale, and his clothes were old and tattered. His eyes were black, like there was nothing inside him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You want your wish, right?" he asked in a low, strange voice. "I made my wish too, but I stepped off the path. Now I'm stuck here, forever." I took a step back, my heart pounding. The words hung heavy in the air. "You're one of them," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. He nodded. "The Forsaken. We're all the same here." His voice was like ice. "And you will be too. Everyone who walks this path, they think they can cheat the rules, but they all end up just like me." I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps were back, louder now. It was time to go. I turned, running down the path without looking back. The forest blurred around me, and I didn't stop until I saw the signpost again, the world starting to fade back to where it should be. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, the path was gone, the woods silent once more. But my heart still raced, and I could still hear the voice in my mind. "The Forsaken don't leave." I never went back, and I never saw Caleb, Maya, or Jordan again. I've heard rumors, though. Some people say they're still out there, looking for their way back, their wishes twisted into nightmares. I don't know if it's true, but I'm not about to find out. I made my wish, and I wish I'd never gone down that path. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before us, with red rocks and dusty paths I had never seen before. Mark was driving, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as the car bounced along the dirt road. Emily sat beside him in the passenger seat, flipping through a map we likely didn't need. We were in the middle of nowhere, exactly what we had been looking for. "Did you know this area is full of old Native American legends?" Mark said, glancing at us through the rearview mirror. "They say skinwalkers used to roam these canyons." I rolled my eyes from the back seat. "Seriously, Mark? We're here to camp, not hear ghost stories." Emily smiled but didn't say anything. I could tell she was already feeling a bit uneasy. Mark had a habit of spouting off strange facts on these trips, and this was no different. Still, the way he mentioned skinwalkers made me uncomfortable. I pushed the feeling down and focused on the landscape outside. The canyons were stunning, with towering red walls and narrow crevices that looked carved over centuries. It was peaceful but also isolating. After what seemed like hours, we finally found a spot to camp. It was perfect. No other campers, no sign of civilization, just us and the wilderness. We set up our tents in a small clearing near a rocky ledge. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the canyon as the colors shifted from orange to deep purple. The sky darkened slowly, and we gathered around the fire to eat, laughing about how we'd survive without cell service for a week. Mark told us more about the area, but this time I wasn't in the mood for jokes. The air had turned cooler, and a light breeze rustled the bushes around us. There was something in the breeze, a faint sound like whispering, but I couldn't make out what it was. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Emily shook her head, looking pale. "Probably just the wind," she said, but her voice didn't sound sure. Mark shrugged. "It's the desert. It messes with your senses." I nodded, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to shift just beyond the firelight, like something or someone was watching us. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, we were miles away from anyone else, right? Later, when we crawled into our tents, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. Branches snapping, footsteps, or maybe just the wind. I didn't know anymore. Then I heard it. My name, whispered softly from somewhere outside. "Ryan." My heart leapt into my throat. It was Emily's voice, but when I peeked out of my tent, She was still zipped up in hers, fast asleep. I stared into the darkness, breath caught in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I knew what I'd heard. It was impossible, but it was real. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tight around me, my pulse pounding in my ears. Something wasn't right. As the fire died outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something worse. By morning, the strange feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. The air was thick, like something was lurking just beyond the camp. I tried to shake off the thought and helped Mark and Emily pack for the hike. We planned to explore a deeper canyon nearby, one we were sure no one else had found. We started hiking, and the sun was already scorching. The heat bounced off the canyon walls, making everything feel even hotter. The path was narrow, with cliffs towering on either side. It was beautiful, but something about it made me feel small, like we were being swallowed by the landscape. Every sound echoed, and it put me on edge. Mark, up ahead, rattled off more facts about the area. These canyons have been here for millions of years. They say they hold secrets no one's ever uncovered. He laughed, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I think he was feeling it too, the sense that something was off. As we went deeper into the canyon, I began to notice things. The rustling I'd heard last night returned, but this time it wasn't the wind. It was something moving, following us. Every now and then, I'd glance back, but there was nothing there. My stomach twisted with dread. I didn't want to freak out, but I couldn't ignore it. I could feel it in my bones. We weren't alone. "You guys hear that?" I finally asked, stopping in my tracks. Emily and Mark turned. Emily's eyes were wide, and I knew she heard it too. "Probably an animal," Mark said, but even he didn't sound sure. "Coyotes, maybe." "No way," Emily muttered. "Coyotes don't sound like that." We kept walking, but the mood had shifted. None of us spoke, but we were all listening for the sound. Came again, closer this time, footsteps. I swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye, something dark and fast, but when I turned, it was gone. We reached a narrow part of the canyon, where the trail barely allowed us to walk single file. That's when the noises grew louder. First, rustling behind us, then the sound of rocks tumbling down a slope. We spun around, flashlights out, searching the shadows. "Ryan, stop looking so paranoid," Mark said, but his voice shook. He was trying to stay calm, but I could tell he was scared. We kept moving, the tension growing with every step. The canyon seemed endless, and each step felt heavier. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us, watching. Suddenly, we heard it clear as day. A voice. "Mark." But it was Emily's voice. She froze, her face going pale. "What was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. Couldn't. We all stood there frozen, staring into the dark canyon ahead. "Let's go back," I said, my voice trembling. But before we could turn, the voice came again. This time it was mine. "Ryan." Chills ran down my spine. Something was toying with us. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. By the time we got back to camp, the sun had set. None of us spoke on the way back. The air was thick, and even the wind seemed to whisper something we couldn't understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. Emily's face was pale, and she kept looking over her shoulder. Mark, usually the confident leader, had fallen silent. He looked tired, like the weight of everything was pressing down on him. "I think we should leave tomorrow," Emily said quietly that night as we sat around the fire. "This doesn't feel right." Mark shook his head. "We can't just leave. We're miles from the main road, and we wouldn't make it before dark." "Then let's leave at first light," I said, my voice more desperate than I meant. "Something's out there, Mark. You can't pretend you don't feel it too." Mark poked at the fire without looking at us. It's probably just wildlife. Coyotes or something, he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. He didn't believe what he was saying, and neither did I. The fire crackled, but it didn't make me feel safe. It only made the shadows grow longer and deeper, as if something could be hiding just beyond the light, watching us. My skin crawled at the thought. I kept glancing toward the edges of the camp, where the trees and rocks blurred into darkness. Every time the fire popped, I jumped, half expecting to see something standing there. Maybe we're just spooking ourselves, Mark said, trying to sound casual. People hear things when they're scared. Emily shook her head, staring into the flames. That wasn't my voice calling your name, Mark. It wasn't me. No one answered. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. What we heard out there wasn't something we could explain. It was something else. Something old. Something evil. The hours dragged on, and the fire started to die down. We didn't talk much after that, just sat there listening to the sounds of the night. I kept hearing rustling in the bushes, but every time I shined my flashlight, there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like a rabbit trapped in a cage, waiting for the predator to strike. Then Mark disappeared. It happened so fast I barely registered it. One moment he was sitting by the fire, and the next he was gone. His chair was empty, his flashlight lying in the dirt. "Mark!" Emily gasped, jumping to her feet. "Mark, where are you?" I called, my voice breaking. No answer, just the wind and the whispering sounds that seemed to circle around us. "Ryan, we need to find him," Emily said, her voice trembling. We grabbed our flashlights and searched the campsite, but there was no sign of him. Panic surged in my chest. Where could he have gone? There was nowhere to go, just endless darkness and the feeling of being watched. Then, after what felt like hours, Mark came stumbling back into the camp, his face pale and wild. He was shaking. "I saw it," he gasped, barely able to catch his breath. "It's real. It's not just stories." I didn't ask what he saw. We packed up as quickly as we could, not speaking, not looking at each other. We didn't even bother with the tents, just grabbed everything and ran. We didn't stop until we reached the road, our breaths heavy, our hearts still racing. The sun was starting to rise, but the night felt like it had lasted forever. We didn't speak about it, and we didn't need to. We all knew the same thing. There was something out there, something old, and we had been foolish enough to seek it out. As we drove away, the desert seemed to stretch on forever, empty and silent. But I knew better now. It wasn't empty. It never was. My name's Tom, and life hasn't exactly been easy for me. I'm 26 now, and I've been on my own for as long as I can remember. My parents, they've spent more time in and out of jail and rehab than I care to count, which left me to figure things out alone. Right now, I'm juggling 2 jobs, one as a server at a local diner and another cleaning offices late at night. Between the long hours and bills that never seem to stop, life feels like a treadmill I can't escape from. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift at the diner, I was nearly at the end of my shift. All I wanted was to finish up the last few tables and head home, but there was this group of young guys, high schoolers probably, acting like they owned the place. They were loud, obnoxious, and making everyone around them uncomfortable. I'd already asked them once to quiet down, but of course, they didn't listen. I walked over, doing my best to stay calm, even though I could feel the frustration building up. "Hey guys," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but firm. "I need you to keep it down a bit. You're disturbing the other customers." One of them, a tall kid with messy blonde hair, glared at me and sneered. "We just came from prom, man. We're just trying to have fun. Why don't you mind your business?" His breath reeked of alcohol, and I could tell he wasn't just drinking soda like everyone else. I didn't back down. "You've been warned. If you don't calm down, I'll have to ask you to leave." The guy's smirk turned darker. Before I could even respond, he grabbed his drink, a large soda, and splashed it in my face. I stood there, drenched, the sticky liquid running down my neck. For a second, everything went red. I wanted to grab him and show him he couldn't treat people like that, but just as I stepped forward, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dave, the diner owner, pulling me back. "Let it go, Tom," he said quietly, his voice calm. "I'll deal with it in the back." As I wiped the soda off my face, Dave shook his head. "I've never seen you this upset before," he said, studying me. "What's going on?" I tried to brush it off, but he wasn't having it. "It's more than just the soda, isn't it?" He was right. For the last few months, everything felt like it was piling up. The long hours, the constant bills, the never-ending grind. I was burned out and exhausted, but I didn't want to admit it. Dave crossed his arms and leaned against the counter. "Tom, you've been working nonstop. You need a break before you crack. I'm taking you off the schedule for a week. Go home, rest, and get your head on straight." First, I argued. I couldn't afford to take time off, but Dave wouldn't listen. He was right, though. I needed a break, whether I liked it or not. That night, I walked back to my apartment feeling lost without work to keep me busy. What was I supposed to do with myself? When I opened the door, the silence in my apartment was suffocating. It was just me, alone with my thoughts, and I didn't like where they were headed. The next morning, I woke up to loud knocking on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I did, I found my cousin Nate standing there, grinning his usual cocky grin. Nate was the kind of guy who always seemed to have it together. Money, confidence, and a lifestyle so different from mine. "Hey, Tom," Nate said, pushing past me and into the apartment. He took in the clutter and raised an eyebrow. "Still living the dream, huh?" I ignored his jab and asked, "What are you doing here?" He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "I rented a cabin in the mountains for a few days. Thought I'd invite you along. You could use a break." First, I wanted to say no. Nate and I didn't have much in common. He loved hunting and outdoor stuff, while I preferred staying indoors, away from bugs and dirt. But then I remembered Dave's insistence on me taking time off, and how lost I felt with nothing to do. Maybe getting out of town for a bit wouldn't be so bad. I sighed and nodded. Sure, why not? A few hours later, we were driving up into the mountains. Nate's truck was packed with hunting gear, rifles, ammo, and enough beer to feed an army. He talked the whole way, mostly bragging about his hunting trips, his job, and the expensive new rifle he'd brought along. I mostly tuned him out, staring out the window as the scenery changed. The trees grew taller, the road narrower, and the sky seemed to close in around us. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. The place was more run down than I expected. The old wooden structure creaked as we approached, and the small, dark windows made it look even weirder inside. The walls were lined with hunting trophies, deer heads, antlers, and animal pelts. It felt more like a hunter's museum than a vacation spot. The air inside smelled musty, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But Nate didn't seem bothered. He threw down his bags, cracked open a beer, and tossed one to me. "This is what you need, man. Fresh air, cold beer, and some quality hunting." I took the beer, but my stomach was tight with unease. The cabin felt too quiet. The forest surrounding it felt too still. Something about this place didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't explain why. As night fell, we sat by the fireplace, drinking. At first, Nate was in a good mood, talking about his hunting plans and how excited he was for me to finally bag a deer. But as the night went on and he drank more, his attitude shifted. He started teasing me about my life, how I worked too much, didn't have friends, and was always stuck in the same old apartment. His words were like jabs, each one hitting closer to home. I tried to shrug it off, but it was getting harder to keep my cool. Finally, when he made a snide comment about how pathetic my life was, I'd had enough. Without saying a word, I grabbed one of his rifles and stood up. "I'm going hunting," I said, needing to get away and clear my head. Nate just laughed. "Good luck, man. Don't get lost out there." I stepped outside into the cold, dark forest, the rifle heavy in my hands. The trees towered above me, and the air felt thick and damp. I wasn't a hunter, and I had no idea what I was doing, but right now, being out here felt better than being in that cabin, listening to Nate's taunts. I didn't plan on shooting anything. I just wanted some space, some quiet. But as I wandered deeper into the woods, a strange sense of dread started creeping in. The forest was too quiet. It felt like something was watching me from the shadows. I don't know how long I walked, but the further I went, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisted like claws. The air was colder now, and an eerie mist had settled over the forest floor, swirling around my feet as I moved. I stopped for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the soft crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. Suddenly, something caught my eye, a flash of movement through the trees. I froze, squinting in the dim light, trying to make sense of it. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe it was just a deer, like Nate said, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. I cautiously stepped forward, my pulse quickening. That's when I saw it, antlers poking out from behind a bush. For a second, relief washed over me. It was just a deer, but as I got closer, my relief turned into horror. The deer wasn't standing. It was lying on the ground, motionless, and torn apart in the most brutal way I'd ever seen. Its guts were scattered across the forest floor, its body mangled beyond recognition. The stench hit me like a punch in the gut, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. That's when I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the trees behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, eyes wide, scanning the darkness. Whatever it was getting closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, from the mist, it emerged. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with dark, matted fur covering its body. Its eyes glowed red, and its teeth were long, sharp, and stained with blood. In one hand, it clutched a chunk of meat, likely from the deer it had just torn apart. I stood frozen, unable to move. The creature snarled a deep gut. My name is Ethan, and I'll never forget that night in the forest. It started like any other evening, with my cousins and me playing a game of hide and seek. We had our own rules, hiding in teams and trying to avoid being spotted. My cousin Tyler and I were on one team, and our cousin Leah and her friend Andy were on the other. We always played in the woods near Grandma's house in rural Texas. But the woods felt different at night. There was something strange about the darkness. Tyler and I wandered deeper into the forest, looking for a good spot to hide. The trees began to look odd the farther we went. They weren't scattered randomly. Instead, they were lined up perfectly in rows. It gave me an eerie feeling, but I didn't say anything. We eventually found a place to hide and turned off our flashlights. The night was still, and all we could hear was our breathing. We crouched there for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for Leah and Andy to come after us. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps. At first, it was faint, like someone stepping carefully on dry leaves, but soon it grew louder and closer. There were no bushes to hide in, only trees and piles of dead leaves scattered across the ground. Tyler and I exchanged uneasy looks. We figured it had to be Andy or Leah trying to sneak up on us. "Tyler," I whispered, "did you hear that?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, but it doesn't sound like them." A chill ran down my spine. We hadn't seen anyone, and by now, Leah or Andy should have been close enough for us to spot them with our flashlights. Tyler's hand trembled as he pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Leah asking where they were. We sat there in silence, trying not to panic. Then I heard it, a soft rustle, like something moving just beyond the trees. Tyler's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and I saw the color drain from his face. "Andy's at the house," he whispered. "Leah's on the porch." My heart skipped a beat. If Andy and Leah were at the house, then who or what was in the woods with us? Just then, something darted past us so fast we could barely see it. Tyler jumped to his feet, shining his flashlight around, but all we saw were rows of trees and deep shadows between them. Whatever it wasn't human, and it was fast. We didn't need to say anything. Tyler and I locked eyes, and we both knew what we had to do. We ran, pushing through the woods, our feet pounding the ground, the leaves crunching beneath us. I didn't dare look back. By the time we reached Grandma's house, we were both out of breath, hearts racing. We stood on the porch, staring into the dark forest. Whatever was out there wasn't Leah, Andy, or any of us, and it wasn't done watching us. Something fast, something dangerous, was in those woods that night. Years went by and I thought I'd moved on. Nothing strange had happened since, right? But even though I told myself I'd forgotten, the truth is, that night never really left me. Life went on, and as teenagers, my cousins and I found new ways to have fun, usually hanging out on the dirt roads near the oil rigs late at night, where nobody bothered us. One night, it was me, my cousin Jake, our friend Mike, and a few others, maybe Luke, I can't remember exactly. We had this favorite spot on a hill, where all the trees had been cleared out, giving us a perfect view of the sky. We'd go out there to smoke and relax, especially on nights like this one, when the stars shone brightly and the air was cool. The open sky always felt peaceful, but tonight, there was something about the quiet that made me uneasy. We walked down the dirt road toward the hilltop, and I lagged behind, a little buzzed, so I wasn't in a rush. The others were ahead of me, laughing and talking, their voices fading in and out as I walked slowly behind. It was calming until I noticed Mike acting strangely. He kept glancing back at me, his face tense, like something was bothering him. I figured he was just high, so I didn't think much of it. When we finally reached our spot, the sky was wide open, the stars sparkling like glitter. I sat on the ground, feeling the cool breeze. That's when Luke came up to me with a strange look on his face. "Hey, Ethan," he said. "Mike's freaking out. He thinks you're a skinwalker or something." I laughed. I thought it was hilarious that Mike, so high, thought I was some sort of mythical creature. Skinwalkers? Those were just stories, right? But then Mike spoke up, his voice dead serious.
"No, Ethan.
I didn't think you were a skinwalker. I saw something behind you." I froze. "What do you mean, behind me?" I asked, suddenly feeling less confident. Mike stared at me, his eyes wide. "When we were walking here, I saw something tall moving behind you. But when I looked again, it was gone." My stomach dropped. I wasn't laughing anymore. Mike wasn't the type to joke around, and the look on his face told me he was serious. My heart raced. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing things?" I asked, hoping he was just too high to know what he saw. But Mike shook his head. "No, man. I know what I saw. Something was following you." I didn't say anything. Couldn't. My mind raced, flashing back to that night in the woods when Tyler and I ran from something we couldn't explain. Was it possible that whatever it was still out there, still following us? That night, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting to see something lurking in the shadows. And from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. A few weeks later, I was at my parents' house. We lived in an even more isolated place now, a spot called Possum Hollow. Yeah, I know, funny name, but the place was anything but funny. It was quiet, too quiet sometimes, the kind of place where, when the sun sets, the only sounds you hear are your own footsteps and the wind rustling through the trees. It's peaceful in the day, but at night, it's different. My younger sister, Sarah, used to love walking the dirt roads around our house after dark, just like I did. We both enjoyed the stillness, but lately, she had stopped going on those walks. It seemed strange, and I wanted to know why. One night, I convinced her to join me for a walk. We were gonna smoke and relax like we used to. She agreed, but she seemed nervous. It wasn't like her at all. As we walked down the road, I asked, "What's wrong? You don't seem like yourself." Sarah hesitated before answering. "I don't like walking out here at night anymore." I looked at her, surprised. "Why not? You used to love it." She bit her lip and finally said, "Something happened." Now she had my full attention. "What do you mean, something?" Sarah sighed and told me about a night she had gone for a walk with our outdoor cat. She said everything seemed normal at first. The cat was following her, meowing like it always did. But then, out of nowhere, she heard another meow. This one didn't come from the cat with her. It came from somewhere ahead in the woods. "There's only one cat," she said, her voice shaky. "So how could there be two meows?" A chill ran down my spine. "Are you sure it wasn't just an echo or something?" Sarah shook her head.
No.
It wasn't an echo. It sounded like something was copying the cat. I felt my heart race as I listened. The idea of something mimicking sounds, especially animal noises, made me think of one thing: skinwalkers. I had read about them before. They're creatures from Native American legend, said to be able to imitate animals or even people. But those were just stories, right? "Sarah," I said slowly, "do you know what skinwalkers are?" She frowned. "Not really." "Why?" I explained everything I knew about skinwalkers, how they could imitate sounds to lure people in, even mimic voices to make you think it was someone you knew. By the time I finished, Sarah's face had gone pale. "You think that's what it was?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's starting to feel like more than just a coincidence." We stood there for a moment, staring into the dark woods around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there watching us from the shadows. We hurried back to the house, staying alert, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the second meow, the story Mike told about something following me, and the thing Tyler and I had run from in the woods. It all seemed connected, like whatever it was hadn't left us alone. It was still out there, watching and waiting. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I needed to face it. Whatever it wasn't going to stop haunting us until we did. But for now, all I could do was keep looking over my shoulder. Last summer, during a vacation I was taking, I decided to go on a hike. One of my other plans for the day got canceled, so I made a last-minute decision to go. The area I was in wasn't really known for having impressive scenery or anything like that. It was mostly flat, with woods all around, but I had nothing else to do. What I did find strange was how, along the trail, there were more paths branching off from the main one. They were all narrow and seemed like they had been made by a few people trying to take shortcuts, but one path stood out. It veered off in a direction completely different from the main trail, and I couldn't figure out why anyone would go that way. I looked around as much as I could, but the trees were thick, and I couldn't see much beyond that. Curiosity got the best of me, though, so I decided to follow it to see where it led. I figured it would probably end up at a pond or something not too exciting, but honestly, anything was better than the main trail. After about 15 minutes of walking, Much farther than I expected, the path ended. It just faded into nothing but grass and trees. I took a few more steps beyond the end, and that's when I noticed something not too far off. A cabin right in the middle of the woods. The cabin was covered in moss, and its roof looked like it was about to collapse any moment. I walked up to the front and saw that the door was gone, though the trees blocked most of the sunlight, making it hard to see inside. I took a few more steps closer until I was standing in the doorway. It was still pretty dark inside, but I could make out bits of debris scattered on the floor, like broken tables and pieces of wood. I held up my phone to give me some light and walked further inside. The cabin had 2 rooms, both mostly empty except for the debris, but there was a door in the middle of the hallway that was partially open. I peeked inside and saw a staircase leading down, maybe 10 or 15 steps, into a basement. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, but since the cabin was obviously abandoned, I didn't think there was any real danger. I made my way down, and as soon as I reached the bottom, a horrible smell hit me. It smelled like rats had taken over. I held my phone up toward the small room at the bottom, which turned out to be tiny, almost like a small closet made of rotting wood. On one of the walls was another door, half open. The light from my phone barely reached the tiny opening, but I could see that it led to a long tunnel. I was too scared to go any closer, so I just stood there, looking at it. From where I was, I could only see a few feet into the tunnel. It looked poorly built, and parts of it were crumbling, with darkness beyond that. Fear started creeping in, and I decided I'd had enough. I turned to go back up the stairs, but as I passed my phone's light over the room, I saw eyes suddenly light up from the corner, under the stairs. I panicked and sprinted up the stairs, tripping over the steps as fear completely took over. I ran straight out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the main trail, and then I kept going until I was safely back in my car, driving away from the woods. I still don't know who or what I saw, but the image of those eyes lighting up just a few feet away from me in that dark basement haunts me to this day. Last year, I stayed at a cabin that's been in my family for years. It's a small 2-bedroom place, really far from everything, but we all use it for vacations, weekends, or just a quiet break. I'd never been too excited about staying there because it only had a hand pump for water and the bathroom was an outhouse across the yard. The only reason I decided to go this time was that I wanted to escape for a few days, and I couldn't afford to rent my own cabin. When I arrived, I was surprised by how isolated it was. I knew it would be far, but this place felt like it was completely off the grid. I parked my car and started the generator to get some power, then used the family key to get inside. It wasn't bad at all, especially since I wasn't paying for it. I set up my things, checked that everything was fine, made some tea, and sat by the fireplace with my laptop. There was no phone service out there, but I had some things I could work on without the internet. I didn't keep track of time, but after a few hours, when the sun had set, I put everything away and was ready to go to sleep. I went outside to turn off the generator to save fuel, and as I was about to head back inside, I saw a light. It stood out, being the only visible light around for miles. I watched it move through the trees until it eventually vanished into the distance. I stayed outside for a few more minutes to make sure it was gone, then went back inside. Being in such a remote cabin, far from civilization, made it unnerving to think that someone was that close. I put out the fire and used a battery-powered lantern to go to the bedroom, then went to bed. The next morning, I woke up at sunrise, made coffee, and stayed inside until midday. After that, I decided to take a walk around the area. I really wanted to figure out what that light was, so I headed toward where I'd seen it the night before. It took me about 20 minutes to get to the spot, but there wasn't a path or any sign of anyone being there. After looking around, I headed back to the cabin and went about my day. I lit the fire again and did the same things as the day before. When it was time for bed, I went outside to turn off the generator, and once again, I saw the light. It was in the same spot as before, but this time it wasn't moving. Stayed still, glowing in the distance. I watched it for a while, but it didn't flicker or move, so I went back inside. Within an hour, I was in bed, asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up, feeling groggy and tired, but I really had to use the bathroom. I stayed in bed, hoping the feeling would pass, but I couldn't wait anymore. I put on some clothes and shoes, grabbed the small lamp, and went outside to the outhouse. After I was finished, I noticed footprints in the yard, right in front of one of the windows. I took a closer look and was sure they weren't mine. I followed the prints around the cabin, and they led to the edge of the woods, stopping at the same spot where I had seen the light. But now the light was gone. My heart dropped, and I ran back to the cabin. I grabbed my things and drove off into the dark, not looking back. I'll probably never know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I want to. I was spending one night at an Airbnb during a road trip I took last year. The place was a cabin in the woods, located halfway through my journey. I planned to stay there just for the night before continuing the rest of my drive. When I got there, it was just before sunset. I drove down a long gravel road for a few minutes until I reached the cabin. It looked older than I had anticipated, and the small dirt path leading up to the front door was muddy from recent rain. After I finally hauled my bags inside, I took a look around. The cabin had very few windows, and despite the sun still being up, it was quite dark inside. I turned on a light in the corner, but it was the only one that worked. I texted the host to ask if I had missed a power switch, but already I was unhappy with the place. Still, since I was only staying for one night, I tried not to stress about it too much. I put my things in the bedroom and then sat on one of the chairs in the living room. Though the decor was outdated, it was still cozy. I took out my phone and began planning the second half of my drive for the next day when I suddenly heard a loud knock on the front door. The knock startled me more than it annoyed me. I had no idea who it could be, and there were no peepholes or windows to see out of, so I just opened the door. A man stood on the porch, wearing heavy winter clothing and grinning widely. It was breezy, but not cold enough for a snow jacket. He introduced himself as the host and said he was there to help with the lights. I wasn't happy that he showed up without telling me, and I honestly didn't care much about the lights, but since he was already there, I let him in. He walked right into the living room and started fiddling with one of the lamps. As he did, I glanced out the window at the driveway. I found it odd that there were no other cars in sight. This place was so isolated that he must have driven to get there so quickly after I sent my text. I turned back to ask him about it, but he was already looking at me from across the room. There was an awkward silence before he apologized and told me he couldn't fix the light. I told him not to worry about it, and I had to get some sleep anyway. I stepped aside to let him out. He left the cabin slowly, walking away without saying anything else. It felt strange, and I was curious about how he could have arrived so quickly without a car, so I watched him. He walked quite a distance down the gravel driveway, looking like he was about to keep walking, but then he stopped and turned around. I watched from the window, hoping he couldn't see me, as he stood there staring at the cabin for a long while. After a moment, he walked off the gravel and into the forest. I wasn't sure what to think, but seeing the man dressed as though he lived outdoors and then walking into the forest gave me a bad feeling. I stayed up for another 20 minutes on my phone, checking the windows from time to time. Just before I was about to get ready for bed, there was another loud knock at the door. This time, I was sure it was the host, but it was too dark for anyone to be arriving. The knocking came again, just as loud and insistent. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed quiet. After a minute, I heard footsteps around the side of the cabin. I cautiously walked to the bedroom, shining my phone light so I could see. I listened as the footsteps stopped right by the window. There was a moment of silence as I shone my light at the window, waiting for them to come into view. Then the person turned and started walking away. I listened until the footsteps faded, then grabbed everything I could and ran to my car. I drove to the nearest gas station, 6 miles away, and called the police. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The police contacted the Airbnb host, and I was shocked to find out that the man who had come to the cabin was not the host I had been texting. They couldn't figure out who the other man was or why he was there, which made everything even more terrifying. The investigation was brief, and I continued my road trip the next morning. But as I drove, there was one thing that stayed with me. How did the man know the lights weren't working if he wasn't the host I had contacted? Maybe he had gone in and broken the lamps himself before I arrived as part of some plan to make me trust him. Or perhaps he was working with the host. Either way, I still don't know what they were planning, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here now if I had stayed at that cabin.